Joining me this morning from Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty, Policy Associate Miranda Spent. Good morning, Miranda. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing good. Thank you for having me on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about this. Evidently, when I read this press release, I mean, maybe I don't have young children anymore, so perhaps I'm not aware that this has now become a crisis. But the Wisconsin childcare crisis and what Will has uncovered and what they're hoping our legislators do to resolve it.
Yeah, so we just came out with a new report. We partnered with the Archbridge Institute, which is a national organization, and they published a 50-state index that ranks childcare regulatory burden, and Wisconsin had the 10th highest. So what we did in this report was we dug deeper into what those regulations were that they use in the index, and then compared them to our neighbors to show where there is some room to remove some unnecessary barriers without feeling like we're going too far in jeopardizing quality or safety of childcare, obviously, because that's the most important, and we don't want to jeopardize that in any way. So we looked at a few different types of regulatory areas. We looked at staffing requirements, facility requirements, and then teacher-to-child ratios. And when we compared them to our neighboring states, we looked at just our neighboring Midwestern states. We saw that one area that we could have a little bit of room for improvement would be possibly increasing group sizes, but particularly with toddlers 2 to 3 years old, and even just adding maybe one extra student that would open up a few slots, hopefully by allowing providers to take on an additional child, being able to supplement some extra income by having that extra student paying the tuition, and hopefully beginning to alleviate some of these issues we're seeing. So what we're seeing in Wisconsin is that prices are particularly high. On average, for a family, it's about a little over $900 a month, which is about 17% of the median household income. And this is a greater burden than some of our neighboring states, where it consumes about anywhere between 3 to 7% less, depending on the states. We're a little bit on the higher end of what families have to pay to afford it, compared to our Midwestern neighbors. And then we do see, what we discussed in this report is going over the literature, some of the research that suggests that regulations do increase the cost of childcare. So, for example, if we were to reduce or increase the add a child to an infant staff ratio by just one child, that would reduce costs by 9 to 20%. And then also it's found that requiring teachers to have a high school degree is linked to a 25 to 46% cost increase. Of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that we don't want people to have a high school degree, or that adding an infant for every childcare provider is going to be the solution, but it just goes to show that there are costs associated with these regulations, and it's worthwhile to look at what are some of the things that we're putting on our providers that are unnecessary burdens, and what that cost impact might be. And then this is an important discussion to have right now. So the backdrop that's happening in the state is that Child Care Counts, which was a COVID era federal funding support for the childcare industry to stay open during the pandemic, that funding ended federally but was boosted by the state. And now that state funding to continue that program is set to end sometime in June. And that's expected to, of course, hurt the childcare industry. But Evers has recommended investing $400 million back into that program. And funding, of course, might help. I'm sure it would, especially in the short term, to help these childcare providers who are burnt out, barely hang on by a thread to keep their businesses open. It would certainly help. However, it's just to stabilize that amount. So we know that in the future it would continue, if not increase, the funding that we're attributing it towards every budget session, and it just isn't sustainable. So what we're hoping that this report does is trying to look at what are some of the other things that we can do, try to expand the conversation beyond will we fund or will we not continue funding this industry? What are other things that we can do to help make this more sustainable for our childcare industry?
Maybe I'm old school, Miranda, because I was a stay-at-home mom with my kids, and so we thankfully, we were blessed to not have to. I mean, and I shouldn't. We were blessed, but it was a decision we made to sacrifice my income so that I could stay home with our boys. But is that at this point unattainable for? I mean, is there a way to, rather than, I mean, I guess as another solution to the so-called crisis, to encourage moms to stay at home with their children and raise them, as opposed to the exorbitant cost of childcare?
Well, I do think that obviously being a stay-at-home mom is a worthwhile endeavor, if not more valuable than doing a 9 to 5 job, and I'm sure most instances or many instances. But I think what we want is that if people make that choice for themselves and they want to make that choice, obviously that should absolutely be supported, and not discouraged, if not encouraged, if that's truly what is wanted by the parents, whether it's the mom or dad staying home. But what we find is that they're doing it not that they wouldn't. It's not that they don't want to work or that they don't want to stay home, but we don't want people to feel forced into that decision because of the cost. If people want to work, we hopefully want to be able to do that. And of course that this is a workforce issue, which is another way to look at this. We want to, we want to make sure that people are contributing and that we're filling the jobs that we have in our state. And it's hard to do that if women feel like they can't continue their work just because they can't afford childcare. And it certainly is the case these days where it seems like the cost of childcare is it's your entire income, where you almost have no choice but to stay home because you're not making enough money to cover the cost of childcare for it to be worth it, and we don't want to put people in that situation.
Well, and I guess, in the greater scheme of things, it's such a small window when your children are young anyway. I mean, from infancy to like age 5. And so, I mean, it's not I mean, sadly, I can attest to this. It's not forever. And as much as I'd love to have my kids home with me, they're adults now and they're on their own. But it is not a forever decision and I mean, my own personal experiences. I left a career in IT and became a stay-at-home mom, and I don't regret it for one moment. The only thing I regret is not appreciating it more during that challenging period of time. But so in our remaining time, I know that the legislature, in fact, from your press release, I know that there was a package of bills introduced in 2023 in the Assembly, but for whatever reason they stalled in the Senate. Do you anticipate that these will be taken up again and perhaps they'll go somewhere this time?
Yes, we do anticipate that. So there were some bills that were introduced in 2023 that we do anticipate will be reintroduced with some changes. They're incorporating some of the changes that were worked through as they were introduced and going through all the discussions and processes, amendments and those kinds of things. So they incorporate some of those changes and then are also a little bit different. But we do anticipate that there will be some bills that will be introduced, and hopefully we'll have a better chance of even more bipartisanship than there was last time, and hopefully getting all the way through this session.
Well, and I know you can't give us too much insider information, but do you recall, or are you aware of why the bills stalled in the Senate? I mean, was there not a sponsor, or was there not a senator a Republican senator that would take them up, or what happened?
I don't remember what specifically happened in the Senate. It is possible that it just wasn't a priority at the time, or maybe felt that it wouldn't get passed by the governor if they did it. However, I do think that a big challenge with these types of bills, especially when it comes to things like ratios, which I do know are increasing child ratios, is not what will be reintroduced this particular session. But that was one of the bills last time, and that does cause concern with child care providers who, just because a ratio is increased doesn't mean that child care provider has to add the extra children. It's just giving people an option who feel that would help them. And I think that's an important point, but there's definitely concern when you add more children that's going to jeopardize quality, especially if they're already understaffed, they're already burnt out. and thinking that that might not be as helpful as we anticipate it being, and that's absolutely valid. And there's certainly many things that have to go into consideration when making a change like that. So it's possible that there was just a lot of some opposition to that, and that maybe they felt it was too early or they needed more time to figure things out. But like I said, ratios specifically are not necessarily what's going to be reintroduced, and we do have some. There's definitely going to be some great, innovative ideas that are introduced, and I'm really looking forward to seeing how that goes once they're introduced.
Well, and I mean, as you've attested to the fact that there are states in which this, while we're towards the top when it comes to heavily regulated states, big shocker there, but you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And as you say, there's innovative ideas that can help alleviate some of the problems. And so it would be good, and I presume that our legislators that are working on this will look to these other states in which they've had successes. And I mean, I guess the $1 million question, so to speak, is whether or not this governor will support this legislation or veto it if it does indeed pass through the Assembly and the Senate.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully these will be bipartisan bills. Like I mentioned, a lot went into how they were drafted this time around, given the discussions that happened last session. So we're definitely hopeful, and that this will be bipartisan, and that if it gets to Evers' desk, that he'll sign it.
Miranda Spint, thanks for joining me this morning. I appreciate your time from Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. Keep up the great work, and I look forward to our next conversation.
All right. Thank you so much.